December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, a dense, frozen wilderness in Belgium, stretched endlessly under a heavy winter sky. Snow blanketed the ground in thick, suffocating layers. The trees, bare and skeletal, creaked under the weight of ice. Darkness fell early, swallowing the narrow roads and muddy trails where American soldiers had been stationed for weeks. This was no ordinary night. This was a night when the very air seemed to conspire against them, when cold could kill as surely as bullets, and when survival itself was uncertain. American troops huddled in foxholes and trenches, dug hastily into frozen earth, their breath visible in the bitter cold, fingers and toes numbed, frostbite creeping silently, threatening to take what bullets had not. They had no time for warmth, no time for comfort. Supplies were sparse, rations limited, and the howling wind carried the distant echoes of German artillery, pounding American positions. Yet even as the forest seemed to close in, the soldiers held their ground. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted. But surrender was never an option. They understood the stakes. If the line broke here, Germany could split the Allied forces, and the entire front could collapse. The Ardennes was a labyrinth of terror. Night fell like a suffocating blanket, and the snowstorm made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. German troops advanced with precision, using every advantage the weather offered. For many Americans, this was a battle unlike any they had ever faced. It was not just the enemy they feared. It was the relentless cold, the darkness, the endless silence, broken only by the occasional crack of rifle fire or the distant rumble of artillery. Every shadow in the forest seemed alive, every movement a potential threat. The cold sapped their strength. The snow slowed every step, and yet they moved forward, because to stop meant death. Inside their makeshift shelters, soldiers whispered prayers, wrote hurried letters home, and clutched their weapons as if the metal itself could provide warmth or protection. They shared glances filled with fear and determination, understanding that in this frozen nightmare, unity was as vital as courage. Outside, the forest seemed endless, a silent witness to the unfolding horror. The snow-muffled sounds creating an eerie, almost otherworldly atmosphere. The enemy was often invisible, and the threat came not only from German forces, but from the environment itself. Ice-encrusted roads that could trap vehicles, snowdrifts that could bury a man in seconds, freezing winds that made even breathing painful. Despite these conditions, American soldiers adapted. They learned to move silently, to communicate with hand signals, to preserve what warmth they could. They rotated shifts watching for enemy movement, scanning the darkness with alert eyes and trained instincts. Every day was a test of endurance, every hour a battle against nature as much as against the Wehrmacht. The men understood that failure meant more than defeat. It meant annihilation for themselves and potentially for the Allied advance across Europe. They were the last barrier in a frozen no-man's land, a line of defense holding back a tide of destruction. This was the beginning of a battle that would test the limits of human endurance. It was a battle fought not just with rifles and artillery, but with willpower, discipline, and the sheer refusal to yield. The Ardennes forest had become a silent, frozen adversary, one that threatened to consume everything in its path. Yet in the midst of this darkness, in the teeth of snow, cold, and enemy fire, the American soldiers stood firm. They were surrounded, isolated, and outnumbered, but their resolve did not waver. In the Ardennes, in the frozen darkness, the spirit of America held strong, unbroken, and unbowed. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for pride. For weeks, the Ardennes forest had been considered a quiet sector. Compared to other parts of the Western Front, it was seen as a place to rest battered units, to train replacements, to breathe before the final push into Germany. The terrain was dense and difficult, the weather brutal. Allied commanders believed the Germans were finished, incapable of launching a major offensive through such conditions. That assumption would nearly cost everything. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the silence shattered. Without warning, German artillery erupted across the forest. Shells slammed into American positions, tearing through trees, roads, and sleeping encampments. Explosions echoed through the valleys, lighting the darkness in brief, violent flashes. Men woke to chaos. Orders shouted through the noise, vehicles destroyed before they could move, communication lines severed almost instantly. This was not a probing attack. It was a full-scale offensive. Under the cover of heavy snow and fog, massive German forces surged forward. Tanks rolled down icy roads. Infantry advanced through the trees, using the forest to mask their movements. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, stripping the Americans of their greatest advantage: air power. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Units lost contact with one another. Commanders struggled to understand what was happening, let alone control it. American soldiers suddenly found themselves facing overwhelming numbers. In many areas, small U.S. units were attacked from multiple directions at once. Roads were cut. Supply lines vanished. Ammunition ran low. Medical evacuation became nearly impossible. Some companies were reduced to fragments within hours, yet those fragments kept fighting. They had no clear picture of the larger battle. All they knew was that the enemy was everywhere, and retreat often meant running straight into German lines. The forest became a maze of confusion and fear. Snow muffled movement, making it impossible to tell where the next attack would come from. German troops, many hardened veterans, exploited the darkness and weather, slipping past strong points and surrounding isolated American positions. By the end of the first day, entire U.S. units were cut off, encircled deep in the frozen woods, and still, they held. Command decisions were made under impossible pressure. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers suddenly found themselves leading men with no guidance from above. Radios froze or failed. Maps were useless in the snow-choked terrain. Survival depended on instinct, discipline, and trust in the man next to you. This was where the American Army revealed its core strength. Instead of collapsing, units adapted. Roadblocks were thrown up at key crossroads. Towns and villages became fortresses. Small groups of soldiers delayed entire armored columns, buying time with their lives. Every hour they held mattered. Every minute slowed the German advance and prevented a complete breakthrough. The enemy believed the Americans would break under pressure, cold, and confusion. They believed exhaustion and fear would do what firepower could not. They were wrong. The Ardennes had become a proving ground. This was no longer a battle planned on maps. It was a test of character. Surrounded, outgunned, and freezing, American soldiers stood their ground not because victory was certain, but because retreat was unacceptable. As night fell again over the forest, fires burned where vehicles had been destroyed, casting long shadows between the trees. Snow continued to fall, covering the dead and wounded alike. Somewhere beyond the darkness, more German forces were moving forward. But in foxholes, ruined villages, and frozen road junctions, Americans prepared to endure another night. They did not yet know how long the battle would last. They did not know how close the line was to breaking. What they did know was simple. This was where they would stand. And the Ardennes would remember them for it. As the battle dragged on, the Ardennes ceased to feel like a forest and became something else entirely. A frozen trap with no edges. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together under constant snowfall and unbroken darkness. For many American soldiers, sleep came only in short, dangerous moments, stolen between shelling and patrols, never deep enough to bring rest. The cold was relentless. It invaded boots, gloves, bones, and thoughts. Men woke to find their clothing frozen solid, their weapons coated in ice, their hands too stiff to load ammunition. Frostbite spread silently. Fingers blackened, toes went numb and never recovered. Some soldiers kept moving, not because they could feel their legs, but because stopping meant freezing in place. Medics worked with bare hands in sub-zero temperatures, amputating when necessary, knowing that infection or exposure would kill those they could not save. There were no warm hospitals nearby. Evacuation routes were cut or under fire. The wounded often lay where they fell, wrapped in blankets that offered little protection from the cold. Food became scarce. Hot meals were a memory. Rations froze solid, forcing men to break them apart with rifle butts or teeth. Water was melted from snow when fuel allowed. Hunger gnawed constantly, draining strength and clarity. Yet even in starvation, discipline held. Supplies were shared. Ammunition was conserved. No one wasted a round. The psychological strain was crushing. The forest never stopped whispering. Branches cracked under snow. Wind moved through the trees like footsteps. Every sound triggered tension. German patrols infiltrated constantly, slipping through the lines, attacking from behind, vanishing into the darkness. There was no clear front. Danger came from every direction. Men fired at shadows, then waited in silence, hearts pounding, wondering if they had given away their position. Encircled units faced the hardest reality of all. No relief was coming, at least not yet. Some American positions were completely surrounded, cut off for days. Radios failed or went silent. Ammunition dwindled. The enemy called out through the darkness, demanding surrender, promising warmth and safety. The answer was refusal, not shouted, not dramatic, simply unyielding. In these moments, leadership mattered more than rank. Sergeants became anchors. Veterans steadied younger men. Fear was acknowledged, but never allowed to rule. Orders were short and clear. Hold the line, protect the road, cover the withdrawal, delay the enemy. Every hour bought mattered. The cold killed as efficiently as combat. Trucks froze, tanks stalled, artillery shells misfired. Yet the Americans adapted again and again, improvising repairs, lighting fires under engines, sleeping beside vehicles to keep them running. They turned villages into strongpoints, barricading streets with rubble and wreckage, forcing German armor into narrow killing zones. The Ardennes was supposed to break them. Instead, it hardened them. Some soldiers would later say that the worst part was not the fear of death, but the uncertainty, never knowing if the next night would be their last, never knowing if help was hours away or days too late. Still, they endured, not because they believed themselves invincible, but because giving up was unthinkable. In the frozen darkness, American soldiers reached the edge of human endurance and stayed there. They did not run. They did not collapse. They waited, watched, and held, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. The snow eventually stopped falling. When the skies began to clear in late December, it was more than a change in weather. It was a turning point. For the first time since the German offensive began, American aircraft returned to the sky. Fighter bombers roared over the frozen forest, striking enemy columns trapped on narrow roads. Supply drops reached surrounded units. The darkness that had protected the German advance now worked against it. Relief was coming. American forces, battered but unbroken, had done what was asked of them. They had held long enough. General George Patton's Third Army executed a rapid, punishing counterattack from the south, driving through snow and ice to reach encircled troops. The movement stunned the enemy. What had been planned as a decisive German breakthrough became a grinding retreat. One by one, isolated American positions were relieved. Soldiers emerged from foxholes, gaunt, frostbitten, and exhausted, but standing. Many had fought for days with little food, little sleep, and almost no hope of rescue. They had held crossroads, villages, and ridgelines that proved critical to stopping the advance. Their resistance forced the enemy to slow, to redirect, and ultimately to fail. The cost was enormous. More than 19,000 Americans were killed. Tens of thousands more were wounded or captured. Entire units were shattered. Survivors carried the scars for the rest of their lives, some visible, others deeply hidden. But the Ardennes did not break the American army. It forged it. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. It was a test designed to exploit exhaustion and doubt. Instead, it revealed endurance, adaptability, and resolve at a scale few believed possible. When the German offensive collapsed in January 1945, the war in Europe entered its final phase. Germany had spent its last reserves of men, fuel, and equipment. The Allies, strengthened by American resilience, surged forward. The road to Berlin lay open. Yet the true legacy of the Ardennes is not found on maps or in casualty figures. It lives in the idea that when everything goes wrong, when plans fail, when weather turns hostile, when the enemy strikes with overwhelming force, what matters most is the will to stand. The men in the frozen forest did not know they were shaping history. They only knew their duty, and they carried it out under conditions that should have crushed them. They were cold. They were surrounded. They were exhausted beyond measure, and they did not yield. Today, the Ardennes forest is quiet. Snow still falls in winter. Trees grow where battles once raged. Most visitors see only a peaceful landscape. But beneath that calm lies the memory of a moment when the fate of a war, and perhaps the world, hung on the endurance of ordinary Americans placed in extraordinary circumstances. The battle fought in frozen darkness was not won by brilliance alone or by overwhelming force. It was won by men who refused to break when everything around them urged surrender. That is why the Ardennes matters. That is why it will always matter.